Today we're going to talk about the passive voice of the present system. And before we go on to form this, let's talk about what voice is exactly. Before we've seen the active voice. When we have a verb in the active voice, in this sentence, the slave boy kicked the dog, our verb is kicked. When we have a verb in the active voice, that means that the subject is doing the verb. In this sentence, the slave boy is doing the kicking. However, the passive voice is when the verb is being done to the subject instead. So in this sentence, the dog was kicked by the slave boy. Our verb, was kicked, is being done to the dog. This is the difference between the active and passive voice. Once again, in the active voice up top, the subject is doing the verb. And in the passive voice down here, the verb is being done to the subject. So let's see how we form this. We're going to go over the entire present system, and if you remember, the present system includes the present tense, the imperfect tense, and the future tense. So let's start with the present tense. Remember that first principal part of the verb up there in red tells you one thing and one thing alone, the first person singular in the present. And because this is the passive voice, we're going to add our passive ending R to this. However, for all of our other forms, we're going to go to that infinitive. We're going to drop off our RE, and this gives you your stem for the rest of the present system. So this VOCA is going to be our stem for the rest of the entire system. And to this, we're going to add our new endings. So our present tense endings for the passive voice are R, ris, tor, mur, mini, and entor. And we're going to translate this passively. So wokor is I am being called. Wokaris, you are being called. Wokator, he, she, or it is being called. Wokamer, we are being called. Wokamini, y'all are being called. Wokantor, they are being called. Note when we translate this, we have the am, are, or is to show that is the present tense, and being in the translation tells you that it is the passive voice. Let's move on to the imperfect. Once again, we said for the entire present system, we're going to go to that second principal part, drop off our RE, and now we have our stem. And to this we're going to add our imperfect endings. And they are bar, baris, bator, bamor, bamini, bantor. And once again, translating these, woka baris, I was being called. Woka baris, you were being called. Woka bator, he, she, or it was being called. Woka bamor, we were being called. Woka bamini, y'all were being called. And woka bantor, they were being called. Remember, when you're translating this, the was or were part of this verb makes it the imperfect tense, and having being in all of these translations makes it the passive voice. Note how the verb is being done to the subject of all of these. And our final tense that falls under the present system is our future tense. We're going to follow that same pattern, go to the second principal part, our infinitive, drop off that RE, which gives you the stem for the entire future tense, and then we're going to add our future endings, which are bor, baris, bitor, bimor, bimini, buntor. And when we translate this, woka bor is I will be called, woka baris, you will be called, woka bitor, he, she, or it will be called, woka bimor, we will be called, woka bimini, y'all will be called, and woka buntor, they will be called. When you're translating this, remember that the will in all of these translations tells you that it's the future tense. You can also use shall if you wish. And the be in these translations tells you that it's the passive voice. Once again, when we have the passive voice, the action is being done to the subject. So let's look at the whole present system together. Here are all of our endings for the present tense, the imperfect tense, and the future tense. These three make up the present system. And these are our passive voice endings. You need to start memorizing these, make flashcards, whatever it takes, but you need to begin to memorize all of these endings. Alright, let's look at the passive voice one more time in a sentence. In this sentence, the dog was kicked by the slave boy. Our verb here is in blue. And remember, because it's the passive voice, the verb is being done to the subject, the dog. Well, what about the person doing this verb? The slave boy, right? Who's doing the kicking? The slave boy. How are we going to render this into Latin? The way we do it is with the ablative of personal agent. The ablative of personal agent is only going to be used with passive verbs, and it's going to be a or ab plus the doer of the verb. You're going to use a when the next word starts with a consonant, and ab when the next word starts with a vowel. Here are two examples. A servo, by the slave. Ab agricola, by the farmer. Now, this will tell you who is doing a passive verb in a sentence. There's one slight thing you have to remember, though. The doer has to be a person. I suppose you might be able to get away with an animal, but it has to be a conscious being. If you have something like, the soldier was killed by the spear, that is not an ablative of personal agent. A spear is not a person. That is an ablative of means or instrument, so try not to confuse the two. Alright, now that we've seen our present system of the passive voice and our ablative of personal agent, let's try to practice on a few sentences. Here are two sentences for you to translate. Pay special attention to how you translate your passive verb and how you translate your ablative of personal agent. Now is a good time to pause the recording and take a couple of minutes to work on these. Alright, let's review number one. Servi ad domino voca bantur. This translates to, the slaves were being called by their masters. Remember, in this sentence, our verb is voca bantur. It is imperfect tense passive voice. So were makes it the imperfect tense, being makes it passive. Our subject, servi, is who this verb is affecting. The slaves are being called. They're not doing the verb is being done to them. And finally, ad domino is our ablative of personal agent, and it tells you who is doing the calling. Who's doing it? Their master. So the slaves were being called by their master. Number two, frumentum ab agricolis servabitur. This translates to, the grain will be guarded by the farmers. So once again, if you break this down, servabitur is our passive verb, and it's in the future tense. So this will tells you that it's future, and the be in your translation tells you that it's a passive verb. What is being guarded? Our subject, frumentum, the grain. So the verb is being done to the subject. It's passive. And who's doing the guarding? Ab agricolis, the farmers, our ablative of personal agent. So, let's look at our takeaways from this lesson. Of course, you have to memorize all your endings for the passive voice, which are over here. And you need to remember that with the passive voice, the subject receives the action of the verb. With our active voice, the subject is doing the verb, but with our passive voice here, the verb is being done to our subject. And that's why we translate it using being or be in our English translation of our verbs. And finally, if you want to tell who is doing the verb, you have to use the ablative of personal agent to indicate who the doer of the verb is. And remember, the ablative of personal agent uses a or ab plus a person, possibly an animal. Don't get it confused with the ablative of means or instrument.